Welcome back to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. Today in the program, we're looking at the state of the free press over the past year, and we're looking at Project Censored, State of the Free Press 2024. We were just joined by the Associate Director, Andy Lee Roth, and we are now joined by another member of our crew here at Project Censored, longtime contributor, Dr. Steve Macek. He's professor of communication and media studies at North Central College outside of Chicago. He serves as co-coordinator of Project Censored's campus affiliates program. He writes very frequently about censorship and First Amendment issues for Truth Out, Common Dreams, and other independent outlets. Of course, Steve Macek also has been, as I mentioned earlier, longtime contributor to our work at Project Censored, particularly around validated independent news, research of the top 25 censored stories. This is all around our critical media literacy, education, and pedagogy, and our curricula that Steve has been a big part of. He also co-authors and researches our Deja Vu chapter in the books every year, which is Deja Vu News. In other words, what has happened to previously censored or underreported stories? Have they been picked up by the corporate media, or do they continue to languish in obscurity? Later in the program, we're going to talk, too, about an unfortunately recurring topic, and that's banned books. Steve Macek has written a brilliant op-ed reminding us of the significance of this issue. We're only a couple of months past the official Banned Books Week, but we're in crisis mode as far as record challenges and bans to books and curricula across the country. Well, Steve Macek, again, couldn't think of someone much better than you to join us to talk about all things censored, media literacy, banned books, and the like. Welcome back to the Project Censored
Hey,
Show.
thanks so much, Mickey. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be on the show.
Indeed, Steve. And I know you had a big hand in putting together a couple of the chapters in the Project Censored annual report on the state of the free press. And people can see that information freely at projectcensored.org. Steve, in the top 25, I just talked to Andy Roth a little bit about that, and we talked about some of the stories, some of the trends and the patterns. And I know that's something that you're very keen on, and that's something that you do in the Deja Vu chapter is there are themes and patterns to the kinds of stories that are underreported and the longevity that they're often languishing in relative obscurity. Steve.
Absolutely. If you look at the corporate news coverage, there are these areas that are, I don't want to say they're completely blacked out or that they're third rails, but they tend to be under investigated, underreported, and undercovered. I understand that Andy talked to you a lot about the way that the establishment press misses important environmental stories that are included in this year's top 25 underreported story list. That is an important theme. The theme of government censorship itself, or government censorship by proxy, another important theme that I understand you and Andy talked about. I just like to touch on one topic that he may not have explored in a lot of detail, which is under coverage of important stories about economic inequality, workers' rights, and the labor movement. Because and it's not a surprise, this is a trend going back 100 years. The corporate-owned big commercial media tend to either ignore labor issues, or they cover them from a sort of pro-business perspective. So one of the stories on this year's list that I think is really interesting is story number 6. Unions won more than 70% of their elections in 2022. This is sort of a continuation of a trend that we've seen, which is that there has been a resurgence of labor union activity, right, in the past couple of years. A couple of years ago, the corporate media was talking about Striketober because there were so many walkouts and strikes. But one of the aspects of this story, the fact that unions are winning their certification elections in workplace after workplace, that isn't being sort of covered very well by the corporate media, is that 70% of those victories were driven by workers of color. Most of the unionization drives that are successful have been for unions that are representing workers of color, who tend to be in industries that are lower paid. And in particular, as the stories that we flagged, the independent news stories that we flagged in this report point out, from Payday Report and the New Republic. They tend to be located, these successful union drives have been in the South among public sector workers of color. And that is completely overlooked, because the way that corporate media have covered this sort of unionization trend makes it seem like it's sort of universal, or that it's mostly involving graduate students or people working in the entertainment industry. But in fact, that's not the case. And it's important because I think oftentimes when the corporate media cover the labor movement, they don't really try to explain why even though vast majority of workers say they want to join a union, there isn't higher levels of unionization in the United States. And some of the articles that we highlight here, especially some articles from Payday Report, kind of highlight the obstacles that exist to union drives, and which makes the success of unionization drives led by people of color all the more remarkable, right? Because they're up against huge obstacles that we have documented in Project Censored stories in the past, right?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back decades. Again, I know you also, as a media historian, and I'm also an historian, and going back and looking at labor history, a lot of that history is suppressed, literally, for the same reasons that you're pointing out, that it's underreported now.
Right, exactly. Yeah, a lot of that history, and it's either suppressed or it's, I would say, like, actively forgotten.
Yeah, right.
Push down the memory hole.
Or as Gore Vidal would have it, the United States of amnesia.
Exactly.
Although I do suggest sometimes that it's hard to forget things that people weren't taught in the first place.
Right.
And
no.
That leads us to the topic that we're going to be getting to later in the program on banned books and attacks on curricula. But Steve, you already brought up a little bit. You've already piqued our interest about history, and that, of course, comes to the deja vu segments here that Project Censored does.
Yeah, absolutely. So every for the past, I think, 4 or 5 books, we have had a chapter called the Deja Vu chapter, where we look back on previous stories that were previously included in Project Censored's list of underreported, undercover stories, to find out what's happened with them. Because, in fact, one of the motives originally for the Project Censored list that Carl Jensen came up with was to garner more attention for these stories that were being reported by the alternative or independent media or smaller local media by the larger national media. And so it is always interesting to track which of the stories that we identified as underreported end up getting more attention from the establishment press, and which ones continue to be forgotten, and when those stories are covered, how they're covered, and what sort of inconvenient facts or perspectives get left out of the coverage. So this year we took 4 stories from past year's lists. The first one was a story from the 2015 list about the media's underreporting of rape and the euphemistic reporting of sexual violence and rape. The fact that the news media often don't call instances of sexual violence, things that meet the legal definition of rape, they don't call them rape. And secondly, the kind of underreporting of rape in the news media. The second one that we looked at and kind of updated had to do with laws on the books that criminalize. This was from a couple of years ago. One of the stories on the list that criminalize miscarriage, basically.
Right. That's from Censored 2020. Right.
Censored 2020. These fetal. It was the number 8 story in 2020 that criminalize these fetal protection laws that potentially could send, we were saying at the time, could potentially result in women being sent to jail,
Well, here
right?
we are post-Roe, Steve
Right,
Macek.
right, exactly. And so let me just
Yeah,
talk
go back. Yeah.
a bit more about this particular story. So
Oh, yeah, sure.
when it was originally included on our list, it was somewhat a speculative story. That is to say, it was originally reported by Ms. Magazine, and what it was warning is that this spate of laws called fetal protection laws that were being passed, in states like Alabama and Oklahoma and so on, could potentially be used to send women to jail, right, for miscarriages and for losing their pregnancies. Fast forward to where we are now, post the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade and a woman's, a constitutional recognition of woman's right to an abortion and reproductive freedom. And where we're at is that dozens of women have now been sent to jail in states across the country for having a miscarriage. Now, in most cases, it's because they have, they either confessed drug users, or they've been subjected to some sort of blood test that proves, or their miscarried fetus has been subjected to a blood test, right? They've done a blood test on the remains of the fetus that show that there's some presence of, say, methamphetamines or some other drugs. And on the basis of those tests, women are being sent to jail, and they're being sent to jail for longer sentences that are sometimes given for like murder and manslaughter and other serious crimes. It is scandalous. So the Marshall Project has done a report. So more recently has done a series of stories about these about women, and most of them tend to be impoverished, poorer women who have drug abuse problems, who are getting sent to jail because they simply had a miscarriage, even though the medical consensus is you can't even you can't there's no way of really demonstrating that drug use caused, right, the miscarriage. There are many women who are heavy drug users who give birth to healthy babies, right? In the end, my favorite example of a case of a woman who got arrested and potentially was being charged with criminally endangering her fetus was involved a woman in Alabama who wasn't even pregnant. So this was reported by Newsweek. The woman was not even pregnant. She was being investigated for something, and her daughter, and she was being investigated for using drugs. Her daughter told the police that her mom was pregnant when in fact she was not. And then on that basis, and in fact, not only wasn't she pregnant, she was menstruating at the time. And she said, "I'm not pregnant." They still hauled her off to jail, subjected her to a pregnancy test. And it was only after the pregnancy test came back negative that they released her from jail. So it was like she was being charged under these fetal endangerment laws when she wasn't even carrying a fetus. So I think that this particular deja vu story was really kind of amazing, because the instances of people being charged under these laws since the Dobbs decision, since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, have skyrocketed.
So, Steve Macek, in this segment, we have a couple minutes left before we want to change topics. Right. One of the stories, an important one that relates to a theme here that we've been hitting on a couple of years now, certainly been mentioning it for longer than that at Project Censored, but it's certainly creeped into the books. Shadow network of conservative outlets emerges to exploit faith in local news. This is a news desert story in some ways, because you're going to talk about, well, if we have this crisis of news deserts in local journalism, what's filling them up, Steve Macek?
Okay, so I don't know how many of your listeners are familiar with the idea of pink slime news outlets, but it has become a trend over the past few years for kind of conservative PACs, lobbying groups, activist organizations, especially supporting particular candidates, to create websites and actual print newspapers that look like legitimate local news outlets. They have the exact form of legitimate local news outlets. They have the same kind of looks like photojournalistic pictures, headlines, bylines from reporters and so on, but they are really just propaganda, and they're mostly created by conservative activists. And this was originally reported by the Columbia Journalism Review did a pretty extensive expose about the growth of these pink slime sites, and they're especially popping up in kind of rural areas of Midwestern states, right? Where Michigan, Illinois, outstate Illinois,
and Arizona as well. Yeah,
Arizona, and places where
less coastal.
A lot of local news outlets have collapsed, right?
Yeah, disappeared.
Have disappeared, have closed up their doors because they're they don't have any advertising revenue anymore, et cetera, et cetera. So we flagged this as one of the underreported stories of the year, or among the underreported stories of the year a couple of years ago. Well, fast forward to today, and the Columbia Journalism Review did a follow-up series and reported that they found 3 times the number of networks of these kinds of pink slime sites popping up. And they especially started to pop up around the midterm elections, right? Around the 2022 elections. Here in Illinois, where I am, we had both fake print publications that were mailed out to every voter in my county where I am. I'm one of the collar counties, as we call it, of Chicago, DuPage County. We got this fake newspaper sent to us, but all over the state. And some of them were circulating what was completely preposterous and made up stories. So I'll just give you an example. There was this site that reported completely erroneously, it was complete fabrication, that there was a school in Oak Park, Illinois, that had decided to award grades to students on the basis of race. Okay. This was a complete and utter fabrication. It got reported on some of these pink slime sites, and then it got picked up and recirculated by Newsmax and other more sort of legitimate or mainstream conservative news sites, and it even got reported, I think, on Fox News, if I'm not mistaken. And it was and it originated with like an utter fabrication.
Product of pink slime times.
Product of pink slime times. So this has actually gotten a little bit of, because it was so egregious during 2022, it did get a bit of establishment news coverage, and that's understandable also because they regard these fake news sites as rivals, right? So the Chicago Tribune ran a couple of stories about the pink slime sites that were popping up in Illinois. And other, I think the Washington Post did stories. That I know NPR did a pretty comprehensive story about the rise of these pink slime sites. And I want to also point out to your listeners that it's not just confined. It's a tactic that is not just used by Republicans and conservatives.
Right.
There people who have studied this have found some, Democratic pink slime networks where they're, creating propaganda sites for Democratic causes and Democratic candidates that look like or simulate real news stories or real news sites. The other interesting thing I think it's worth pointing out is there was a study done by some researchers at Stanford that found that it may not have any impact, that that only like 3.7% of the population have actually been exposed to posts from these pink signs
Right.
sites, and that it has really no influence over how they vote or how they think about the
So,
issues, which I think is an interesting finding, right? There's millions of dollars,
being poured into this.
being poured, dark money,
Mhm.
activist dollars being poured into these pink slime sites, and it may not have any
Well,
impact.
Steve Macek, before we celebrate the idiocracy saving itself, because we
Because
don't look
people
at, we
just
don't,
don't pay attention.
they're not paying attention to the fake news and the pink slime. I'd like to remind our listeners, you're tuned to the Project Censored Show. I'm your host, Mickey Huff. I'm speaking with Professor Steve Macek at North Central College, contributor to State of the Free Press 2024. We're going to continue our conversation after this brief musical break, and we're going to turn our focus to the attack against the freedom to read and what you can do about it. Stay tuned. Steve Macek, you recently wrote a dispatch for us at Project Censored at projectcensored.org, where you can see it for free, the attack against the freedom to read and what to do about it. Now, Steve, at the project here, we've been involved in Banned Books Week and part of the National Coalition Against Censorship and so on for over a decade. But in the last couple of years, we've been quite alarmed to see the number of challenges and book bans accompanying state legislative challenges to curricula across the United States. So, and Banned Books Week was just a couple of weeks ago, and you have just delivered this really impactful piece about the significance, the importance, and I think and all too necessary ringing of an alarm bell. I don't find this hyperbolic at all. Steve Macek, tell us about this and the challenges the book's going on nationwide.
Well, I don't think it's probably any news to your listeners that over the past, I would say 3-4 years, that the US has seen a really dramatic spike in book bans at public and K-12 school libraries. And we've seen just a huge upswing in kind of pro-censorship activism by a number of kind of right-wing groups, and they're usually targeting, right, books that are about race, gender identity, or sexuality. So, to put some numbers to it, I would encourage everybody to look at PEN America's September 2023 report, School Book Bans, the Mounting Pressure to Censor. In that report, they point out that over 3,300, that in the 2022-2023 school year, there were over 3,300 reported instances of book censorship in K-12 schools, impacting something like over 1,500
titles, yeah.
different titles. And that represents a 33% increase over the 2021-22 school year, and a really dramatic increase over the last time they actually looked at this issue, which was back in 2016. Meanwhile, the American Library Association, has been keeping track of book bans for a very long time, and they claim that this past year they had the highest number of book challenges, that is, people trying to keep books off the shelves in K-12 school libraries or public libraries, that they have ever seen, right, in history, as long as they have been tracking it.
And Steve Macek, almost 40% of these titles are about race and racism. 37%, almost 40% are about that particular issue.
Almost 40% are about that, and then a similar number are about the LGBTQ plus community. Those are the two real topics that these would-be censors are targeting. And what's been driving this, I think it's important for everybody to know, is that yes, there has been this sort of grassroots right-wing activism. So there are groups like, I'm sure everybody who's listening to the program have heard of Moms for Liberty, right? Which was started by some school board members and Republican Party activists in the state of Florida, including Bridget Ziegler, who's the wife of Christian Ziegler, who's gotten into a little bit of trouble, has been in the news a lot lately. They started this group up essentially because they thought that originally the group started to protest against masking in classrooms and some other measures that were taken during COVID, but they shifted their focus since the end of the pandemic to kind of actively campaigning to get information about sexual identity and
The
gender
war on woke,
identity,
right? The war on woke.
the war on woke, and information about the civil rights movement and race relations in this country out of the classrooms.
Which,
and
by the
so-
way, I want to suggest very quickly, and I want you to continue,
Yeah.
but
yeah,
parental rights and parental involvement in school, that's a serious issue.
it
And
is.
and what's going on here, however, is a particular type of involvement that's really kind of, I'm not sure who's hijacking whom here, but it's disingenuous to suggest that this is just some concerned parents,
Oh,
given the astroturfing and all the money that's going on here.
Absolutely. And I would label Moms for Liberty an astroturf
Okay, there you go.
organization. I think they claim to have, 280 some chapters and 100,000 members. But if you look at who funds them, it's the same funders who are behind the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And nobody had heard of them, right?
Right.
Until all of this money started flooding in, and the leaders of the Moms for Liberty started appearing in right-wing media and being, celebrities on Fox News,
And maybe that's
talking about these
backfiring.
issues. And then maybe that's backfiring. But in any case,
Yes.
they have been enabled by a series of laws that have been passed in state legislatures, and usually Republican-controlled state legislatures, like the state legislature in Florida, in Texas, Oklahoma, Utah, and other places. And these laws basically, so for example, in Florida has adopted a couple of laws that make it possible for parents to very easily challenge, right, books that are included in school libraries. And in the state of Florida, for example, Moms for Liberty has been going around school district to school district, presenting basically the same exact list of books that they want taken off the shelves. And they are books like Fun Home, Genderqueer, All Boys Aren't Blue, and I Am Jazz, and of course the children's book, Tango Makes Three, about two male penguins who adopt a penguin chick, and they want these books taken off the shelves. And in the case of Florida, Moms for Liberty, members of Moms for Liberty have actually reported school librarians to the police for distributing child pornography because they were handing out books that were on these lists.
Penguins.
I don't think it was Antango Mag. They didn't
penguins
go that far.
Subverting the dominant paradigm.
They didn't go that far, but they were targeting like a kind of innocuous, fantasy book that involves some people who make out.
But this is a serious issue. And Steve, if you start litmus testing, you're going to go back and ban most classic books. Exactly. Why don't we just stop reading altogether, Steve Macek?
There's right. Well, the state of Florida has adopted a sex education law that, depending on how it's interpreted, could be used to purge from the school's curriculum Shakespeare, The Diary of Anne Frank, and other classic books that most Americans of my age grew up reading in school. They were assigned books.
Steve, this has gone so far as there's some states, and I may be mistaking this, but I think it's Iowa. If not, apologies to Iowans. But it's a Midwestern state where they were banning sex ed. They were banning any of these kind of books and any kind of sex ed. Any kind of sexually explicit material for children before the third grade. And according to the state's own curriculum,
that's Florida. But
according to the state's own curriculum, they don't teach that subject before that grade. So it was totally political theater. No, this was a state other than Florida. This was not, it was a copycat state.
Because Florida adopted this rule that said you can't even mention.
But it's posturing because it doesn't even apply. And again,
identity.
Teachers have enough stress and enough issues to deal with as it is, particularly after the pandemic. And now we see legislative efforts to try to curtail things that they're not even teaching at all.
Right. No, and let me just, I don't mean to pile on to Florida, but they adopted this law, since you reminded me.
We only have 2 minutes, so go ahead, Steve.
The sex education law that basically would make it illegal to teach about any aspect of sexuality to girls who are going through puberty, right, below the age of 15. So you would, like a teacher, if the teacher had a girl in class who was menstruating, would not be able to explain to her what what was happening,
yeah.
because that would be a violation of state law. That's outrageous to me, that it's actively promoting ignorance.
So Steve, you go
Yeah,
on. It is true. You go.
yeah,
We're running out of time. We got about a
sure.
minute left here, and you have a lot in your piece. The piece is titled "The Attack Against the Freedom to Read and What to Do About It." It's available at projectcensored.org for free under dispatches. So you talk about more than Florida, more than Moms for Liberty. You talk about legal action, and of course, you talk about the Tavion Daniels, whom we had on this program earlier, as the youth honorary chair, Cameron Daniels. A group in Texas called Students Engaged in Advancing Texas SEAT. So there's pushback. There are people pushing back against this, Steve Macek.
Absolutely. And let me just highlight a couple of things that have happened. So first of all, there are lawsuits that are being brought to challenge these book bans by the publishers working together with parents who want their kids to have access to those books in those school districts. This has happened in Florida. There are laws that have been adopted at the state level by Illinois and also California. Congratulations, yes. California, that basically penalize schools that ban books from their or that ban books on the basis of their treatment of sexuality, gender, or race. So that engage in discriminatory banning. That basically prohibit it in the state of Illinois. School libraries that remove books on that basis will not be allowed to access state funds. And in California, I think they impose a fine on school districts that do that, that remove books on that basis. So those are some hopeful signs. But there's also the grassroots activism of young people who are forming banned book clubs at their schools to read banned books and banding together to speak out at state legislatures and at school board meetings against bans. And that, to me, is the most encouraging thing of all about this whole saga.
It is, Steve Macek, and we're out of time for this segment. But as ever, we could keep going for quite some time. And I'm sure we will into the future. Steve Macek, professor of communication and media studies, North Central College outside of Chicago, longtime contributor here to Project Censored. We've been talking about State of the Free Press 2024, patterns of underreported stories, and now we were just talking about the ongoing uptick to challenges in books and book bans across the United States. Macek is author most recently of a piece at projectcensored.org, The Attack Against the Freedom to Read and What to Do About It. You can also learn more by going to the ALA.org, the American Library Association, bannedbooksweek.org, which is the website for the official Banned Books Week Coalition. I've had them on the program many, many times. And also, please feel free to check out PEN America that Steve Macek mentioned earlier here. There are a number of resources, including NCAC, or the National Coalition Against Censorship and the Right to Read Project. So there's a lot of places to get informed, a lot of places to get involved, and we hope our listeners will do just that. Steve Macek, as ever, thanks for joining us on the Project Censored Show.
Thanks
Always
so
a
much.
pleasure.